Hello everyone, and welcome to this, our week 3 class for peace studies. Um, as you know, there was some technical difficulties last week which prevented me from getting this accomplished, but actually we had that Monday off anyway, so perhaps it wasn't such a big deal. But this week, however, I would like to commence, as per our plan, a series of lectures which will run on Mondays every week. Instead of our regular class time, I'll be here appearing to you on YouTube, which is kind of interesting, and I hope it will work for you. Certainly it would be nice to think that we could continue this way, but if it doesn't work, if it creates problems, certainly we'll be able to divert and think about on going back to our old modality, but seeing as we have the technology, it's an interesting approach. So, what are we talking about at the moment? We just maybe recap on last week. We spent a lot of time talking about Johannes Galtung and his theory of sort of split-level theory of imperialism and its relationship to war, wherein, of course, he's sort of suggesting that the entire modern world-state system, of course, has come out of this European modality of imperialism. Not just that, though, but that as imperialism sort of proceeded, and I think this is useful language for us, it created, or tended to create, kind of subaltern positions even within its basic starting point of as a peripheral relationship, or as a core peripheral relationship. So we had on the margins of these sort of colonial possessions, we had the potential for conflict, the potential for upheaval or political unrest, and indeed, I think if we sort of take that lens and apply it to our thinking about Gourevitch as we've been reading him this week, it's quite apparent that some of that language is relevant and useful for us. So I think perhaps Galtung is onto something there. Now, if we talk just a little bit about Gourevitch, because we didn't really get around to talking much about him the last week, and I just wanted to really sort of hit on some of the themes this week that maybe we should have hit last week, and then we can, of course, hit up the rest of the book when we meet on Wednesday. But just some core themes that emerged for me out of the first half of the book. The idea of a complexity of power, or a complexity of the way power relates to discourse. We tend to think of political power as something that we possess in our hands, like a hammer or like a saw, like that power is a tool, that a tool like that, a sword or a gun, gives us power. But I think Gourevitch is really challenging that idea that power is simply a tool, or that power is simply an instrument that we can wield. I think he's suggesting that we are as much in power as users of power, or wielders of power. But what does it mean to say we're in power? Of course, we talk about presidents being in power and kings being in power, dictators being in power, but I don't think that's what he means either. Although power is, of course, I think for him situational. No, I think he's talking about something else. I think he's talking about the fact that power, especially when it comes to language, when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to what we're calling discourse, is very much a thing that makes us, a thing that poses us as who we are. In other words, it constitutes us. Power is what makes us function. And to say we're in power is much to say, like we might say, we're standing in a river. Power is flowing around us, perhaps through us. Do we wield it? Do we possess it? Do we master it? No, I think in fact what he's suggesting is that power wields us. And you see this very clearly, of course, when he's talking about the legacy of European colonialism, and how, in fact, that the language of the European colonists picked up on moral tropes and needs that were present in their own sort of intellectual space, and how they tried to impose their values, their views on other people that they saw as they traveled. and of course the states that they constituted, the nation states that they fabricated out of thin air, in a manner of speaking, were there to shore up, to reinforce, to arbitrate on that knowledge once it was implemented or put into work, once its plans were set in motion. So I made some notes about Gourevitch, which I think appeal to those themes, and I wanted to talk with you about them. Just about this first point, power. I think one of the things that really comes through about the book is its relationship to some of the other philosophies and concepts of power that we've seen. Many of you have taken class with me before, so you know we've talked about Foucault and we've talked about Hannah Arendt. One person we haven't really talked about is Theodor Adorno. That's Adorno. And what's interesting to me is how much like Adorno was interested in his commentary on the sort of the complexity of the Nazi Holocaust in World War II, was how very modern it was, how very organized it was, and in a way how this is, I think, a crucial point that confronts many people, including Hannah Arendt, who think about the Holocaust of World War II, is how organized it was. And how it took work, you know. It's not just a question of, holocausts happening out of thin air. You know, they have to be organized, they have to be put in place. But they're not just organized in a top-down fashion or slapdash fashion. They don't just come out of nowhere. Oftentimes, it takes a multitude of authors, a multitude of political agitators over the course of decades to put the structure in place. And of course, it's never clear, even then, that a genocide is imminent or around the corner, because all these acts, in a way, seem very ordinary. They seem to be kind of acts and discourses that, exist perhaps problematically on the margins of our daily lives, but nevertheless, they are part of our daily lives. And so it's this kind of question of the complexity of daily life, what Arendt, Arendt, what Hannah Arendt originally sort of termed the banality of evil. And I think that theme is coming through very, very clearly here, the ordinariness of evil. An evil perhaps that creeps in so slowly you don't notice it, and perhaps doesn't even deserve the term evil at the end of the day, because, as Arendt observed when she went to the Eichmann trial, it wasn't clear that Eichmann was very guilty of anything that you'd sort of expect a arch henchman of Hitler to be doing or to have done. Much of what he had done in his daily existence was very, very ordinary, involved checking out train timetables and moving around or planning logistically the moving around of various resources. So it's hard to see in that, which is, the sort of thing that all of us do every day in a way. We're all part of a logistical life, and it's hard to know if what we're doing is perhaps complicit in evil sometimes. But it could be, and of course I think that's the challenge of evil in a highly complex society, in a highly complex world. Some of the interesting things that came out from later chapters, well, actually, maybe if we just start at chapter 1, and then I'll work my way through. I think one of Gourevitch's main points in the chapter 1, anyway, was this idea of an ideology of genocide, and the notion that something so completely unorganized in some ways was nevertheless organized and took time, as I was saying, to put in place. So how do you create an ideology of genocide, and what's the idea of what is the function of a thinking about an ideology of genocide as an actor itself, as having its own power, and a power that perhaps was at work over a period of decades before it finally expressed itself in the awful genocide. One wonders if the power of that kind of an actor, of a discursive actor, is only really viewable or understandable after the fact. Do human beings have the power to preemptively see that kind of power work in the society that they live in, or is it not the case that it's something that comes along as time goes by, that grabs them as time goes by and sets them to work in these ways? The legacy of European colonialism is another theme that came up, and I wanted to talk about that. Chapter 4 gave details about Rwandan pre- and colonial history. We learn about the original people who lived there and how they're pretty much almost gone. The Twa, pygmy people, who are down to about 1%. But that's neither here nor there, I suppose. Although it's sad, the forces of history have left us with perhaps a much greater tragedy to contend with. It's not clear to me that the Twa were, at least from the text anyway, that they were butchered or anything like that. I think they just pretty much dwindled. Although perhaps that could be challenged through research if any of you were interested in looking it up. But the origins of the Hutus and Tutsis are basically undocumented. I think that's the point that he is trying to make. And it's clear that most of the narratives that are to do with the difference between the Hutu and the Tutsis are quite founded in myth more than anything else. And also, the role of the European colonists in creating some of this myth is very, very interesting. As the Europeans, we learn, desired to see themselves in those who already seemed to occupy the higher positions of power. The Europeans yearned to sort of identify those who were lording it over the others as being closer to themselves. So therefore the Europeans assumed that the Tutsis would have been descendants of more North African peoples who would therefore be closer to Europe. But I think what cannot be gainsaid, reading the text, and it's fascinating, I think, the way the author Gourevitch poses this, is how the people were already quite intermingled. And that's a theme you see. Another similar book to this, it would be Michael Ignatiev's The Warrior's Honor, which is focused in quite a bit on the Yugoslavian conflict. And he makes very, very similar observations in that book about how really these discourses and these narratives are not sort of all that easily implemented or put in place because they have to struggle against the fact that on the ground people are already living in difference. Ordinary everyday people are already living in tremendous difference and getting along with each other in that difference, marrying each other, living alongside each other, learning each other's languages, having children together who are of both races. And so that's certainly a very interesting part of the history, that there's a lot of muddy water between the two races, and it's hard to separate them both from each other. That requires discourse, and it requires a hyperbolic discourse, if I can use that word, a discourse that's kind of working double time to patch itself up and make itself amenable to exceptions to the rules, and it could excuse itself for its mistakes. We learn about Odetta in the book, and how she is mistaken for a Hutu when I think she's not clearly of that race at all, but she's married a Hutu man, and of course back at work a woman who is definitely a Hutu gets mistaken for her because she's tall, and that woman gets taken away and beaten and then subsequently taken away again and killed out of mistaken identity of being a Tutsi, another woman called Odette. So that's sort of part of what we're dealing with here, this kind of almost ridiculous nature to which these discourses have to reach to close the circle of their logic when they're coming up against things that they can't quite explain. But I think one of the most interesting parts of Chapter 4 is the quote from political theorist Mahmoud Mandani, who's someone some of you who've taken class with me before may have read before because we've talked about his work before. But he's talking here in this quote about the history of academic scholarship, the sort of scientific legacy of the European colonists as they brought sort of forms of science that we might not necessarily today recognize as science, but certainly back then they would. And this is a history of knowledge that has actually been powerful insofar as it has enabled not just the European colonists at the time of the colonialism, but also subsequently to that, the Hutus and the Tutsis, to a certain extent, were internalizing those concepts and those narratives, even though they weren't real. So that's very fascinating for us. And it leads our author to offer, I think, one of the most powerful quotes of the book on page 48, where he says, "So Rwandan history is dangerous. Like all history, it is a record of successive struggles for power, and to a very large extent, power consists in the ability to make others inhabit your story of their reality. I think that's really, really interesting. It's worth reading again. To a very large extent, power consists in the ability to make others inhabit your story of their reality, even as it is so often the case when that story is written in their blood. So this is, something that would ring true for the way the Europeans approached the Rwandans and created them in a way, made them who they are. And also how the Rwandans themselves internalized a lot of this knowledge and then turned it back on themselves, creating differences between them, creating hierarchies between themselves, and it's just it's really fascinating. I think excuse me, there's some sort of siren going on there. I don't know what that's about. Hopefully, we'll pass very soon. Maybe it's a fire engine or something. I'm visiting a friend's house at the moment, so I have no idea what the rhythms are of the local fire station. Anyway, back to our story. I think one of the things that's really interesting is then how it ultimately, and this pops up again and again, you kind of have to look for it in the text, but the term, the state, pops up quite often, and the author doesn't really go into sort of any detail to sort of theorize the state or give us an understanding of what the state's role is here, at least not in the first half of the book. But it is very interesting that the state comes in, and the state is part of our narrative. And we saw this, of course, with the Germans, but also subsequently the Belgians, who were only too happy to exploit the opportunity of the advantage that the state power gave them. And this is what Gourevitch calls flexible colonialism on page 55. I wish he would go into more detail on that term, because I'm fascinated by it. Flexible colonialism. I'm sort of prompted to think, like, well, what is flexible colonialism? I think it's not hard, maybe once you've done a little thinking about it, to imagine what it might mean. You know, the idea that, of course, empires are costly affairs. And this brings us to Galtung, from last week. And Galtung's very aware that, the European powers themselves weren't really that powerful at the end of the day in material sense. It's said that Britain was able to take over India with a ridiculously small number of soldiers, simply by using divide and conquer techniques. And of course, I think that's what Galtung was talking about last week when he was talking about the fact that in the periphery there's a core and a periphery. And I think here we also have the certain flexibility of colonialism, an ability to interpolate, it's a big word I suppose, interpolate, to seduce or to co-opt, might be a better term, the local elites, the local hierarchies into your apparatus of power, and to give them a sense of belief of their sort of role or superiority. And of course this is what's going to inflame and aggravate the Hutus when later on in life, after, as we learn, after the Cold War, they reassert their domain and try to balance the scales. But ironically, using a language that's very, very similar to the European language, and using concepts and ideas derived from that European language, which of course some cynics would say, and I think we would have to agree, that this is supremely ironic, because of course it bespeaks the idea that rather than gaining their freedom, they were in fact further enslaving themselves in the European way of looking at the world. And of course that's very, very sad. So on to just some brief information about chapters 5 and 6, and then we'll wrap it up. I thought there was some interesting stuff about the power question coming back in there. For example, the power of notions of demons and things like this in chapters 5 and 6. Also, we come across a person that's perhaps familiar to us if we know a little bit of our history of animal rights and that kind of thing. The naturalist Dian Fossey, page 81 to 82, having sort of from all her years living in Rwanda become herself, it seems, very superstitious, even though she was a Western lady. But in her time in Rwanda, of course subsequently she was killed in Rwanda, and the book goes into a little bit of investigation as to maybe who killed her or why, but that's not really why we're interested, and I don't think that's why Gourevitch is interested. He's interested in the Dian Fossey story because it's an anecdote that speaks to the powerful grip of superstition on the mindset of people from Rwanda. And the fact that there's a sort of a mistrust in Rwanda about things like poison, and there's a sort of culture of drinking out of the same vessel, so that if anyone's going to get poisoned, they're all going to get poisoned together. Um, I suppose that fits with the book in a certain way, because I think what Gourevitch is interested in is getting into the sort of deep culture of Rwanda and its complexity and its messiness, and in a way do the one thing that I think Westerners generally fail to do. And I can say this also having read the Ignatieff book Warrior's Honor, that we have a tendency to sort of say, oh well, sure, these people have always been fighting each other, they've always been enemies, they've always been at each other's throats, why should the West intervene, what possible good could it do, why would the West have a stake in this? As an American a diplomat once said, I'm afraid I can't remember the guy's name, but he said, we've no dog in the fight. And I think that was a Bush senior operative, I think a high level, maybe Department of State, maybe the Secretary of State or something, but I'll look into that. But we've no dog in the fight, so why bother? And I think, of course, what the text seems to reveal is actually that there's all kinds of complexities here to that question. Perhaps it's not so clear that we have no dog in the fight, both in terms of our interests, but also in terms of our actual sort of complicity in the deep history of the conflict. And of course, what's fascinating as well, and I wish he'd go into more detail about this as well, but he doesn't, is that with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the new calls from the former colonial powers for democratization, I think there's some interesting stuff there that speaks to us very loudly of how it was sort of handy for the European and the Western powers to sort of have their cake and eat it too during the Cold War. But now that the Cold War's been won and it's time for the New World Order, we're changing the rules and everybody has to democratize. Also, similarly, the IMF and the World Bank coming in, and instead of expressing their sort of colonial sort of mandate and trying to keep these countries on side through various grants and development projects, now they're sort of cracking the whip and saying, haha, you guys are in too much debt and we need to see you balance your fiscal balance sheet. But it also suggests that around about this time we can see the impact of a certain economic strife. And I was glad to see Gourevitch bring that in, because I think one of the themes that we'll see again and again in this class is the role of economic hardship in generating a lot of these conflicts. And I think it's sort of all of this then is what sets the scene for the events that would subsequently, 2 decades later at least, become one of the worst genocides that we have ever seen, certainly in recorded history. The invasion of the Rwandan, the RPF organization, which is largely a Tutsi organization to try to agitate against the Habyarimana regime. But then, of course, the Habyarimana regime using that as an excuse for a crackdown, staging a sort of a theatrical war outside of the capital city as a pretext for a crackdown. I thought that was really interesting, and I never knew about that, but it certainly speaks to the idea that there's theater involved in this conflict as well as everything else. So those are just some comments there from Gourevitch, and it might be worth thinking about doing a bit more work in that book. I think there's some more things to be divined from it, but we'll talk a bit more about it when we meet in class on Wednesday. But in the interim, I thought just some comments on another bit of the reading that I thought was interesting for this week, and that is the Chris Hedges text, which is quite simple. Chris Hedges is talking about war as a force that gives us meaning, and you guys are probably sick of me mentioning the death drive, the death instinct that we were reading Freud the previous week, and of course I've interpreted that as a sort of an impulse on the part of human beings to find in danger and in risk a sense of existential purpose. And I think it's just interesting to read Chris Hedges here talking about the existential issues that war sort of allows us to confront through its culture. And I don't know what you guys thought about it, but it's definitely worth reading. Um, for example, when he talks about fundamental questions about the meaning or meaningless of our place on the planet are laid bare when we watch those around us sink to the lowest depths. Um, War exposes the capacity for evil that lurks just below the surface within all of us. Again, I think that's a theme that was there in Gourevitch. I think that both of these authors are drawing on this kind of dubiousness, or implausibility of the narrative that sometimes gets passed around, that we moderns are very scientific and we are enlightened, but at the time Germany, being the most civilized country on earth, became fascist, and what happened to its modernity then? I think that's the question that I think is being raised here, is that, we, and I think Hedges is very good at this. He's up there with Hannah Arendt in that regards, that there is a tendency for us to congratulate ourselves for being so modern, but then to find that in ordinary, everyday ways, we are very obedient to this modernity. We're very obedient when authority comes a knocking and tells us to take up arms or to do something. And I think what I like about this Chris Hedges piece is that it forms such a nice counterpoint to the Rwanda story and the Gourevitch story, because it shows that, heck, even, here, we are maybe not so different to the Rwandans. We wonder how it could have happened over there. How could people have come to have so much hatred for each other? And yet we see in our obedience, perhaps, to the call of war, to the call of war's culture, and our own, perhaps, yearning for answers to our most existential questions, a real temptation to turn off our critical minds and to sort of go with the flow, to be carried along with war's rhythm. I certainly think that's kind of one of the points that he's getting at here. The story here of the disgusted Polish soldiers who, during World War I, killed a lot of Jews, I think being a case in point there, that they were carried along, but then, of course, what did it mean for them? They had to sort of deal with it afterwards as well. Clearly, that the point being here that this tendency on our part to be carried along with war doesn't exactly come to us for free, or doesn't exactly come to us without a cost or a price attached. I think that's a very important thing to reflect on. The second point that Chris Hedges is addressing is the point about war as myth, and here he's talking about, of course, the fact that we tend to rally round the soldiers, especially you've seen in relation to the Gulf War and the war in Afghanistan, the sort of ribbons on the back of people's cars, going honor our troops. And one wonders, and I think I don't think I'd be putting too many words in Chris Hedges' mouth in wondering whether the best way to honor the troops sometimes would be to bring them home, but that, of course, sentiment is wrapped up or immediately sort of serves as a magnet for all kinds of attention from people who are interested in, condemning that kind of thought as unpatriotic. Because war as myth is a time where we, again, because we like solid meaning, because we like, in a way, the fact that heroes, which is something we're steeped in since from our time when we're a child, the cult of heroism that war seems to produce reaffirms some of the meaninglessness in our lives, or assuages might be a better word, assuages some of the meaningless that we might otherwise find in our lives. And the media, of course, being all too happy to step in there, and I think Hedges could have gone into a bit more detail there about the media, because I think he's making this really interesting point that the media was all too willing in some ways to be used, as he says. The media was very content to sort of be deployed as a propaganda arm of the U.S. government during the Gulf War, and of course, with its very dazzling graphical images, with its sort of night vision sort of scenes and vistas of lights flashing and bombs going off, the shock and awe of the invasion of Iraq, for example. For the folks back home, the war is presented in a very sort of Star Wars razzle-dazzle way. But as Chris Hedges observes, for the soldiers on the front line, as he knew a Muslim soldier who ended up shooting a little girl by accident, the realities can be so much more different to the razzle-dazzle that the people are presented with back home. And the soldiers coming back from the Vietnam War were very quick to remind us, as I think perhaps many of the soldiers coming back from the current wars would be as well, that war is not really, that this business of heroism is perhaps not as clean cut as it's sometimes made out to be. And just pause for a minute, actually, when you think about that, because it occurs to me that reading Hedges, he could almost go into a lot more detail about some of this stuff. But we think about Jessica Lynch, for example, the weird contortions that the U.S. government jumped through and put itself through in order to try to present her as a hero, when in actual fact she was a very ordinary person, and at the end of the day she was very keen to say that she hadn't been sort of held in a way that was unhumane or anything. She was given top-class medical treatment. She received hospitality at the hands of her captors. And then we also have the Pat, oh gosh, I'm afraid I'm going to blank on his name, but the American football player who was shot by his own men, and the U.S. government again putting itself through contortions to try to present Pat Tillman, as a kind of a heroic figure, when in fact, and you have to wonder how they got away with that. That was a very cynical move. But Pat Tillman, the facts of his death were nothing like it turned out in the end. Nothing like he was represented to be at the height of the war. But he was a famous football star, and people wanted to remember him and sort of honor his death in a manner appropriate to his status as a hero. And the media was very much central to that. So finally, that leads us, if we've talked about war of culture, war as myth, one of the other things that Chris Hedges is sort of talking about in terms of how we find answers to our existential dilemmas through war is this idea of war as crusade, the idea of war against evil, the idea of war against some sort of challenge to our democracy, that it has a purpose, that we're doing something good, we're doing something righteous. And he cites the author Philip Caputo, who talked about his book on the Vietnam War, Rumor of War. But somehow our idealism was lost, our morals corrupted, and our purpose forgotten. And that this is, I guess, the disillusionment that comes once you've realized, having had your experience at the front line, that what you thought you were fighting for and what you ended up fighting for were very different. Because of the complexity of war that we've been talking about. And this sort of puts all countries, America, but also other countries, I think, engaging in war in a very difficult situation where you're trying to reconcile your idealism with the fact that you end up having to sort of push this propaganda of an evangelical war on your people through the media, through the official government channels, constantly reminding people of the righteousness of the cause. But ultimately you have to wonder if what you're doing to win that war is perhaps undermining your own democracy. We've talked at great length in other classes, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with some of these stories about the warrantless wiretapping that was going on, the domestic surveillance, which typically is thought of because it falls under the purview of criminality, that the American standard for engaging in that type of behavior usually requires a judicial warrant of some sort. But this was warrantless wiretapping, which started under Bush, and Obama says he's not doing it anymore, but it's not clear what the degree of continuity is between Obama and Bush. Certainly a lot of the powers that Bush was given by the Congress after 9/11 are still there, and they have not been reneged upon by Obama. He hasn't given them up yet. So perhaps then, most interestingly of all, Chris Hedges concludes his short piece here by asking the question, obviously, so then there's an impact on our democracy because we believe we're so righteous, perhaps, that we're willing to accept all these compromises to our institutions and their integrity. But perhaps also then, more troublingly still, just the impact on our thinking, as it becomes very, very hard for us to think outside the box. We can He says here at the end, all bow before the supreme effort. This is vis-a-vis self-critical thought. We are one. Most of us willingly accept war as long as we can fold it into a belief system that paints the ensuing suffering as necessary for a higher good. Of course, and who wouldn't, right? But for human beings seek not only happiness but also meaning. And tragically, war is sometimes the most powerful way in human society to achieve that meaning. But I think as he's saying, there are definitely costs attached to that. So that is, just to wrap up there, just my survey of some of the things and themes that come out of this week's reading. We will join together on Wednesday to discuss the rest of this week's reading, and I look forward to seeing you then for that. Take care, guys, and I hope this works for you. Let me know if it's an issue at all, and we can talk about perhaps tweaking it some way that will work for you better. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.